Broadcasting from New York City to the world, it's the G-Man Interviews.
While Barack Obama decides whether to provide Ukraine with military arms, the US is helping in another way, says our correspondent in Ukraine. Some 250 American troops are in the country to help train Ukrainian soldiers as the conflict with pro-Russian rebels in the east continues. The training near Lviv in the west of Ukraine is being provided by US paratroopers.
We will demonstrate the training with our weapon systems. Then we will allow them to imitate the training that we've actually provided to them. And then at the very end is actually a review of what they've learned and an evaluation to help them get better.
Some 900 Ukrainian soldiers are involved in the training exercises, and the country's president attended the opening ceremony. He says, "My decision as the commander-in-chief to build a new quality army, the armed forces of Ukraine, is beginning to become a reality with the help of our American partners." The training is expected to last 6 months and comes on top of other US logistical support. Russia has condemned the presence of American troops in Ukraine, slamming it as a provocation.
Welcome. Joining me once again to provide an update on the crisis in Ukraine is Matthew Dubas, editor of the nationally distributed publication, the Ukrainian Weekly. The newspaper is also distributed throughout Canada and serves as a major source of news and information for the Ukrainian community in America and abroad. He has reported on many of the country's political and social conflicts and worked with ambassadors, politicians, policy advisors, activists, and scholars on a range of issues concerning Ukraine. Nice to have you back on the program, sir.
Thank you for having me, G-Man.
First and foremost, how are your family members holding up in the midst of the turmoil?
Reports that we're getting from my relatives in Berdyansk, which is just west of Mariupol, is things are getting a lot more active with shelling. Kharkiv is another area that is potentially targeted by Putin, as well as Odessa, as we've seen with recent terrorism attacks with bombs going off in these cities. It's unclear where safe is, especially in any sort of conflict zone.
Have they set a time frame as to when they'll be evacuating?
It's not a time frame. It's based on what the attacks are on Mariupol and how extensive they are. And if they start seeing the tanks actually roll in the city of Mariupol, Russian tanks particularly, then they know that they're going to have to evacuate. So it's wait and see.
On April 27, the G-Man Interviews received the following information from the White House, Office of the Vice President. Vice President Joe Biden met at the White House today with Vitaly Klitschko, the mayor of Kiev, Ukraine. The Vice President and Mayor discussed a conflict between Russia and Ukraine and the vital importance of implementing reforms in Ukraine. Mayor Klitschko outlined reforms undertaken in Kiev over the last year to improve transparency in public procurement and the city's budget, as well as efforts to implement e-government solutions to reduce corruption and streamline provision of city services. The Vice President underscored the importance of such efforts and noted one of the clearest measures of progress in implementing rule of law reforms would be holding individuals legally accountable for corruption. Looking back over the last year, would you say Mayor Klitschko has made good on his word to reduce corruption and streamline the provision of city services in Kiev?
I would say that Mayor Klitschko has taken steps within his power to get the ball rolling. He's not going to be able to change it overnight. I think having those kind of expectations is kind of grandiose, but it's optimistic. I would say that what he needs to do really is to remove elements that are associated with the previous regime. And I think that what we're seeing from certain steps that he's already taken, and even the Vice President's words, I think we see that there is that reinforcement of progress and to motivate to keep them on this path of reform.
As noted in the opening segment, U.S. troops were deployed to your country to train members of the Ukrainian army. Various news reports have given the impression that American and Ukrainian soldiers are one big happy family. Would you say that's an accurate assessment of the situation?
I would say that Ukrainians would more than welcome U.S. assistance, but they don't want necessarily boots on the ground. They want Western technology and the training that is necessary in order to be able to use this new hardware and new technology, I think. But the average Ukrainian does not expect or does not envision American presence as a permanent force in Ukraine for defense. For training and stuff like that, I would say yes, there is that hope, but they want Ukraine to stand on their own. They don't want necessarily America to have a permanent military presence in Ukraine.
And in terms of the U.S. troops having the support of Ukrainians, if you could give me a number or ratio, would you say it's 50-50, 60-40?
I would say 70% probably support U.S. action to either arming or to provide technological support. But for a permanent force or any sort of that thing, that it's a little too early to say. We'll have to see how recent polls will indicate how even perspectives for NATO membership for Ukraine and the sentiment is among the population to either go or just remain neutral.
President Obama has sent U.S. troops to Ukraine, as previously stated, but he's been extremely reluctant to send weapons and continues in his effort to impose even tougher sanctions on Russia. What would you cite as the reason for his reluctance, and will imposing tougher sanctions be enough to stop President Putin?
I would say the motivating factors for President Obama in not sending weapons would probably be to not give any ammunition for Putin to claim that this is an escalation or for President Putin to increase his actions in eastern Ukraine. That's probably the number one thing. The number two thing is weeding out the pro-Russia elements out of Ukraine's military and security services. And I think that given the time that already has transpired since President Poroshenko has come to power, there has been this major shift, but I think that there still is reluctance. We'll see how these training exercises go with the American Army and Ukrainian National Guardsmen, and I think we'll see what the fruits are of that within the next 6 months.
And the second part of my question, will imposing tougher sanctions be enough to stop President Putin?
Tougher sanctions will hopefully deter, but it has to be targeted. The reason why it takes long for these things to happen is it's minimizing blowback from any sort of sanctions that you put on one country and how trade is just interconnected that way in the global world we live in.
Now, in the previous episode, you had indicated that Putin was not a man to be trusted, and you stated that unequivocally. The Euro News report used in the opening segment also indicated that the Russian president and the members of his cabinet viewed the troop presence as a provocation. This being the case, how likely is it that President Putin would flex on the U.S. by ordering Russian troops to form an alliance with pro-Russia rebels and overtake certain sections of Ukraine?
I would say that if Putin wants to direct his suspicions or animosity towards the United States, I don't think that he would want to necessarily continue with what's going on in Ukraine, because he's already stagnated. So it's not going to work out for him even in the long term. So for him, it's really about distracting by causing some sort of problem elsewhere, as we've seen with what's going on with Norway and Svalbard there, with former Russia's NATO ambassador Dmitry Rogozin landing there illegally while being under sanctions under the European Union. I think these are great threats, and these are the flexing that we're seeing with Russia. We're seeing also things going on with Finland. In the Karelia region of Russia that borders right on Finland, there has been going back and forth with that. And then you have Lithuania, and then you have all these other different quote-unquote problem areas that Putin has at his disposal.
Not too long ago, you informed me that a lead source for the Ukrainian Weekly had to flee Ukraine because they were in danger. Were they able to leave without incident? And how are you receiving information at this point?
Our correspondent has returned to Ukraine, I'd say, soon after things kind of settled down after the Euromaidan protests. Then afterwards, things kind of became back to normal in Kyiv itself. I know people who have traveled all over from Moscow through Ukraine, etc., and they have a better idea of the nuances between East-West, Moscow, Ukraine, and our correspondent has primarily focused on the promises that the politicians have made and whether they're sticking to it.
Okay, sir. I have no other questions. You take it from here. What additional information do you have on the conflict?
Let's see. The new guy in Kyiv, who is appointed as the new head of the Anti-Corruption Bureau, he's 35 years old. His name is Artem Sitnik, and he's a former investigator for the Kyiv prosecutor's office. He was appointed by the president, and he has dismissal rights as well as parliament. Parliament can dismiss him after the international audit. His term is set at 7 years, and he brings experience as a former prosecutor assistant and an investigator in Kirovohrad Oblast. He has little to no political experience, which is seen as a good thing because it doesn't make him tainted from the old system. This has been also an example that Latvia has followed, and I think Latvia is in coordination with Ukraine as far as keeping this anti-corruption bureau independent from the political establishment.
Would you say he's been well received by Ukrainians up to this point?
Still too early to say. I would say that most experts are saying that this will take 6 months to really see who he surrounds himself with. That will be telling as well.
Okay.
There have been some ties with his prosecutions of certain scandal-ridden prosecutors. The real test will be his prosecution of high-level judges and even low-level judges. I think that will be the real difficulty, and see how much dirty laundry is actually dug up, and who is affected by the blowback.
Well, let me ask you this. Given that people have been killed, reporters and so on, and some allege it was by the government of Kiev, how likely is it that this guy's going to be able to actually do his job?
That's another thing. Like I say, time will tell. It's one of those things where we'll probably know within the next months of how he goes about his business, who he surrounds himself with, who is on his team, who is he taking advice from, depending on whether he wants to do coordination with the Baltic states. I think that'll be important. What we're seeing with certain journalists and former politicians being killed, I would say that this might also be a hand of Moscow tying up loose ends, not necessarily the Kiev forces targeting these journalists or politicians. NATO is beefing up its presence in Europe, but there's still a lack of commitment from EU and NATO members on contributing their fair share for defense budgets. Other motivators include Finland, Sweden, and Norway hinting at NATO membership, which was for a long time a taboo subject even to mention.
And I was recently informed that there's something going on in the Arctic. What's the story there?
What's called as the Arctic conflict area, where Putin is really deploying a lot of heavy equipment to the Arctic and basically stating in very clear terms that Russia is committed to the Arctic. And I think the United States is slow to respond and simply doing whatever it is doing under the cover of climatological cooperation. There's an Arctic Council that is now going to be headed by the United States, goes on a rotating basis. And these members include Canada, Russia, Finland, Sweden, Norway, and Denmark and Iceland. And the United States is skirting the issue and basically pretending that they're not so as concerned with Putin's flexing in the Arctic. And I think that this is a dangerous game that the Obama administration is playing.
And as far as your country's president, Petro Poroshenko, what's his position on this?
On the Arctic?
Yes.
Ukraine doesn't necessarily have any sort of say in the Arctic Council, I guess. I would say that Ukraine is definitely concerned that Putin can use this to really upset the balance of order, not only in Europe, but he will use the Arctic as his means to say, well, nobody really is too concerned about the Arctic because nobody really lives there, so he can use it as his own playground. And time will tell if the U.S. response is going to be adequate or if it's going to embolden Putin to go further. From the rebel-held area, this leader, Alexander Zakharchenko, who is a warlord for the Donetsk People's Republic, quote-unquote, has called for a new referendum to be held. And it's funny because the Minsk Agreements calls for such a thing to be held under Ukrainian law when the fighters put down their weapons and Russia's troops withdraw from Ukraine. It will be a back and forth with Russia saying to Ukraine, we don't want Donbass, you take it. And Ukraine saying, you have it now. But we will return to us because you can't hold on to that type of burden. This is the type of scenario that Putin wants, a no man's land in eastern Ukraine where it's a financial drain for Ukraine. Crimea is the other area that is not forgotten, but we don't hear too much from Germany or France regarding its return to Ukraine. Putin plans to turn the peninsula into a nuclear military base, which we've heard is closer to the reality that the nuke threat is constant, but the reliability of his nuke arsenal is questionable. He's using nuke flexing as kind of like a last resort. The Russian enclave of Kaliningrad between two NATO members in Europe, Lithuania and Poland, is another spot that Putin is eyeing to park some nukes in Europe. The nuclear threat is real, but whether Putin's nuclear reliability and capability is up to snuff is another question. Another major development is Putin's state gas monopoly Gazprom is under investigation by the European Commission for antitrust law violations. This is basically hitting Putin where it really counts, and I think Putin understands that the time is really ticking for him to either pay up, settle out of court, or play by the rules. And I think that he doesn't like to play by the rules, so he's probably going to settle out of court.
All right, let me close out with this. Your last appearance on the show, you made a prediction, and you indicated that Russian forces would overtake Debaltseve, which they did. Let's see if you can go 2 for 2.
Well, I would say that judging by the way that we see troop movements and the way that Putin is massing troops in Russia just over Ukraine's border, I would say that something in the east is brewing. We probably won't see anything really happen until after the May Day parade, May 9th in Moscow. Or we might see it simultaneously, simply to reinforce that Putin is working towards whatever victory is for the Russian people. I'd say Mariupol is definitely in his sights. Kharkiv is definitely in his sights, as well as Odessa. Those 3 major cities, I would say, are potential targets. How soon we can see action, I would say within the month.
And you predict that he might do this despite the fact that U.S. troops are in Ukraine?
Sure. Putin claimed that his losses were caused by American soldiers, even though they're not even anywhere near the area of conflict zone or front lines.
It's always a pleasure having you on the show, sir. Thank you.
Thank you, G-Man.
Thank you for joining me, ladies and gentlemen. I greatly appreciate it. And until next time, stay cool, stay safe, and stay informed.